Boardroom. Cold lighting. The screech of a chair dragged across marble floors. David, voice trembling, face drained of color. Claire, you don't understand what's happening here. Claire sets the envelope down on the table, eyes locked on him. Oh, you're wrong about that. I understand perfectly. That signature isn't mine, but your laptop was apparently very busy at 2 o'clock in the morning. David's jaw tightens. Caroline sits beside him, red dress, face gone white. Caroline, voice sharp as glass. You're just a bitter ex-wife trying to tear down what you couldn't keep. Claire cuts her off, voice never rising. Over the past 6 weeks, you downloaded confidential documents from your own husband's acquisition portal, then forwarded them to your brother-in-law's firm in Denver. Your husband's security team logged every single transfer. The room goes dead silent. Ryan Reed, seated directly across from his wife, slowly places both hands flat on the table. Ryan, measured, quiet, heavy as stone. Caroline, did you really believe my security team wouldn't trace it back to you? The red of Caroline's dress suddenly looks a great deal like blood. Narration. The night my husband packed his bags and walked out for another woman, her own husband showed up at my front door with an envelope full of evidence. And 2 years later, slipped a ring onto my finger. The full story is right below. Don't scroll past it if you want to know what happened inside that courtroom. I want to tell you about the night I stood in my own bedroom doorway holding a bottle of wine. Not a new bottle. The same label we had served at our wedding 12 years before. Because David had found a case of it at an estate sale and thought it was romantic. I had thought so too, back when I believed romance and reality lived in the same house together. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the nights I allowed myself to stop working at 9 instead of 11. A small mercy I gave myself, usually forgotten by 9:15. That particular Tuesday I had actually made it downstairs. I had opened the wine. I had found 2 glasses, because some part of me still did that automatically. Still set 2 of everything, as if marriage were a table you kept laying whether or not anyone sat down to eat. And then I heard him upstairs. Not a sound that alarmed me. Not a crash or a voice I didn't recognize. Just the particular rhythm of drawers opening and closing that I had learned over 12 years meant he was packing. I knew the difference between David packing for a weekend conference and David packing for something longer. The conference version was fast and slightly irritated because he could never find his cufflinks. The longer version was slow, methodical, like a man settling an account. I carried both glasses up with me. I don't know why. Force of habit. The wish, maybe, that I would get to the doorway and find something ordinary. What I found instead was my husband standing over an open suitcase with his passport on top of a stack of folded shirts, and his phone lighting up on the dresser every 40 seconds, and his face wearing an expression I had not seen in years. Not guilt, not grief. Something closer to relief. He didn't hear me at first. I stood in the doorway and watched him tuck his cufflinks into their velvet box, with more care and tenderness than he had touched me in 2 years. And I thought, this is what it looks like when someone has already left. The body just hasn't caught up yet. Before I could say a word, I heard a sound I did not expect. The doorbell. Our housekeeper, Margaret, appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her face drained of its usual warmth. She said, "Mrs. Marshall, there is a man at the door. He says his name is Ryan Reed." David went rigid in a way I had never seen before. Not the controlled stillness of a man composing himself, the locked stillness of a man caught. I set both glasses of wine on the hallway table. I walked downstairs. Ryan Reed was standing in our entryway with a dark coat still damp from rain. He was 44 years old, and he did not look like a man destroyed by betrayal. He looked like a man who had done his research, made his plan, and arrived at exactly the moment he intended to arrive. He held a sealed envelope in one hand. He looked at me with something that was not quite apology and not quite pity, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. He said, "Mrs. Marshall, I am deeply sorry we are meeting this way." I said, "Come upstairs." Ryan Reed, as I would learn over the following weeks, was the husband of Caroline Reed. I had met Caroline once, at a charity gala the previous winter. Silver dress, champagne laugh. The kind of woman who knows exactly how much space she is taking up in a room and has decided she deserves all of it. She had stood just a little too close to David all evening, and I had noticed, and I had filed it under the same drawer where I kept all the things I noticed but chose not to examine too closely. David was still at the suitcase when we reached the bedroom doorway. Ryan placed the sealed envelope on the dresser without being asked. He looked at the suitcase. Then he looked at me. He said, "Caroline charged a suite in Paris to one of my business accounts. Your husband used my private aviation contractor for the return flight. Neither of them is quite as careful as they believed." David said, "You don't get to walk into my house." I said, "My house." The silence that followed that correction was one of the heaviest silences I have ever sat inside, because it was true. The house had been in my mother's family for 30 years. I had mortgaged it to save David's first hotel after a catastrophic expansion he had refused to slow down. I had paid back that mortgage myself. From royalties on software, David still called a company asset in every investor presentation he gave. My house, my mortgage, my name on the deed. I opened the envelope Ryan had brought. Inside were photographs, travel records, expense statements. The first photograph showed David kissing a woman beside a private terminal. The date stamp on the photograph was 8 months earlier. The night David had missed my birthday because of what he called an unavoidable mechanical delay on his return flight from Cincinnati. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I did not cry. I did not tear it in half. I put it back inside the envelope and I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as the sound a lock makes when the right key finally turns it. Not the lock opening. Not yet. Just the recognition that the key exists. That the thing I had been telling myself was paranoia and exhaustion, and the ordinary erosion of a long marriage was something else entirely. And then Ryan Reed said the thing that changed everything. He said, "The reason David is leaving tonight is not Caroline. There is a board meeting tomorrow at 10 in the morning. He has been negotiating a sale of Marshall Hospitality Group for 6 months. He has represented to my acquisition team that the Meridian forecasting platform, your platform, belongs to the company outright. My technical team believes that representation may be false." The room was very quiet. I looked at David. He was looking at the floor. "I want to say something to you right now, before we go any further into this story, because it matters. If you are ever in a situation where someone is rushing you, rushing a signature, a decision, a sale, a settlement, stop. The urgency is almost never about your benefit. It is almost always about theirs." David had spent 6 months quietly arranging a transaction that would require him to misrepresent the most valuable asset he had. And the timeline of his departure had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with a 10 o'clock board meeting he needed to reach before I understood what I had been signing away. I looked at Ryan Reed. I said, "When exactly is the board meeting?" He said, "Tomorrow, 10 in the morning." I said, "Then he did not leave tonight because he was being kind. He left because he needed to be gone before I understood what was happening." Ryan looked at me steadily. I said, "Mr. Reed, would you like coffee? We appear to have a transaction to stop. Before I tell you what happened the next morning, I need to tell you about the world I had built. Not because I want your sympathy, because you need to understand what was at stake. You need to understand what 12 years of quiet, invisible, uncredited work actually looks like when someone finally holds it up to the light. My name is Claire Marshall. I am 38 years old, and I am a software architect. Not in the decorative sense that some companies use that title. In the literal sense, I build the structures that hold systems together. I look at a broken process and I see the underlying logic of why it fails, and then I write the code that fixes it. I grew up in Vermont, in a small house my mother kept with the particular fierce tidiness of a woman who had very little and refused to let any of it go to waste. She was a bookkeeper. She taught me that numbers tell the truth when people won't. She died when I was 26, 2 years after I met David. And the last project she saw me working on was a draft I kept in a worn leather notebook. The first sketches of what would eventually become the Meridian forecasting platform. Meridian was not a complicated idea. At its heart, hospitality businesses, hotels especially, run on patterns, occupancy patterns, spending patterns, service demand patterns. The problem was that most hotels tracked these things in silos. A front desk system that couldn't talk to a housekeeping system that couldn't talk to a restaurant reservation system. Data that lived in separate rooms and never had a conversation. I built the room where they could talk. Meridian pulled data from every operational system a hospitality business ran, found the connections between those data streams that human managers were too busy to see, and made predictions. Not vague predictions, specific ones. On a Tuesday in February, your occupancy will drop by 14% unless you adjust your weekend package pricing by Thursday. Your restaurant will see a 30% spike in dinner traffic the following weekend because a regional conference is booking the hotel next door. Adjust your staffing by Friday. David had 3 failing boutique hotels when I finished the first version. Within 18 months of deploying Meridian, all 3 were profitable. Within 3 years, Marshall Hospitality Group was being written about in trade publications as an innovative newcomer with a proprietary technology edge. David was the one giving the interviews. He was good at it. I want to be fair about that. David Marshall was genuinely charismatic, genuinely energetic, and genuinely skilled at the human side of hospitality. He could walk into a struggling hotel and in 40 minutes make every employee feel like they were part of something worth saving. That was real. I am not rewriting our entire history to make him a villain from the beginning. But there is a particular thing David did at company events that I had spent years dismissing as social awkwardness, when it was actually something else. Every time we were introduced as a couple at an industry function, every time someone asked about the technology behind Marshall Hospitality's success, David would smile his warmest smile and say some version of this. Claire prefers to stay behind the scenes. She's the quiet genius of the operation. And then he would move the conversation forward. He never lied, not technically. He never said he built Meridian. He just never said I did. My best friend Beth Calloway, a high school art teacher who has known me since we were in graduate school together, and who has the particular combination of bluntness and loyalty that makes a truly great best friend, had been pointing this out for 2 years. She would say, "Claire, when did you last do something just for you?" I would say, "I love what I do." She would say, "That is not what I asked." I would change the subject. Here is what I wish someone had told me then. When a person consistently makes themselves smaller to keep the peace, they are not being selfless. They are slowly erasing themselves, and the people around them learn to expect it. David had learned to expect it. The board of Marshall Hospitality had learned to expect it. The investors had learned to expect it. I had spent 12 years making myself so quiet, so accommodating, so frictionless, that when the moment came for David to represent my work as a company asset and my name as a signature he could place wherever he needed it, there was very little resistance in the system. I had built that frictionlessness myself. That was the hardest thing to sit with later. The night I found the contact saved in David's phone as CR. The night I lay awake in the dark next to a man who was already somewhere else in his heart. The story I told myself was, "You are probably misreading this. 12 years. You do not blow up 12 years over a misread." I have since learned to recognize that voice. It sounds like caution. It sounds like maturity. It sounds like the measured wisdom of someone who has seen enough of the world to know that snap judgments are dangerous. What it actually is, very often, is the voice of a person who is more afraid of being right than of being wrong. Because being wrong means you overreacted. Being right means the life you built was built on something hollow, and then you have to decide what to do with all those years. Silence is not the same as peace. I learned that the hard way. I had been living in silence for years and calling it a marriage. Meridian Logic LLC, the company I had formed to hold the intellectual property before David and I were even engaged, was still legally mine. The license agreement I had signed with Marshall Hospitality had always been renewable, always revocable, always mine to control. I had written those protections in at Beth's insistence. Actually, Beth, who knew nothing about intellectual property law, but knew everything about protecting the things you make with your own hands. On the morning after Ryan Reed arrived at our doorway, I called my attorney before I called anyone else. Then I got dressed. Cream blazer, my mother's pearl earrings. And I drove to the building where 12 years of my work lived inside servers I had designed and maintained and upgraded on my own. My access card had been deactivated. I found this out at 7:45 in the morning when I pressed it against the reader in the lobby of Marshall Hospitality's headquarters, and the light stayed red. The security guard at the desk, a young man named Carlos who had always greeted me warmly, looked at his screen with visible discomfort. He said, "Mrs. Marshall, I'm seeing a notation that your access has been suspended pending a board resolution." "I'm really sorry," I said. "That's all right, Carlos. I'll sign the visitor log." He printed me a visitor badge. His hands were very steady, but his eyes were apologetic in the way that told me he had been briefed this morning and was not happy about what he had been told to do. I signed the visitor log with my full name and I took my badge and I sat in the lobby and I waited. Ryan arrived at 8:15 with 2 attorneys and a forensic investigator carrying a locked evidence case. He was wearing a charcoal suit and the same composed expression he had worn at my doorway the night before. We shook hands the way 2 people shake hands when they have spent the previous evening planning something that will alter the course of both their lives. Which is to say, we shook hands like the gesture was almost irrelevant, because something much more significant had already passed between us. His lead attorney introduced herself as Naomi Price. She was 50 years old, precise in her movements, and had the particular quality of stillness that I associate with people who are used to being the most prepared person in the room. Naomi said, "We have 2 objectives this morning. Stop the acquisition from proceeding and establish a clear record of the ownership discrepancy before David's legal team can move any documents." I said, "There is a 3rd objective. I want every board member to understand what they were about to sign their names to." Naomi looked at me carefully. Then she nodded. The boardroom was on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. A long table that seated 20. David sat at the head of it, in a suit I had helped him choose for a conference in London 3 years ago. He looked up when I walked in, and the expression that crossed his face lasted less than a second before he composed it back into something neutral and professional. But I saw it. It was the expression of a man who had expected to walk into this room and find the door locked behind me. Caroline Reed sat beside him. She was wearing red. She had the polished confidence of a woman who has spent her life in rooms exactly like this one, and has never once been asked to justify her presence. She looked at me when I entered, and her expression arranged itself into something that was meant to communicate mild surprise and mild amusement. As if I were a complication that was unlikely to amount to anything serious, she said. I didn't realize spouses were being invited today. Ryan had followed me into the room. He took the seat directly across from her, he said. Apparently they are. The color left Caroline's face so quickly it was almost physical to watch. Naomi distributed folders to each board member at the table. She stood at the presentation screen. She was exactly the kind of person who does not waste a single syllable. The acquisition agreement currently before this board lists the Meridian forecasting platform as Marshall Hospitality's primary proprietary asset. We are here this morning because that representation is false. I stood up. Meridian is not owned by Marshall Hospitality Group. It has never been owned by Marshall Hospitality Group. It is licensed under a renewable agreement from Meridian Logic LLC, an entity I formed and registered before David and I were married. That license agreement contains an explicit provision prohibiting transfer of the license during a change of control event without my written consent. The acquisition you are being asked to approve today constitutes a change of control. I have not given consent. I will not give consent, David said. Claire signed a licensing assignment. The paperwork is in the acquisition folder. I said. I signed a draft acknowledgement permitting due diligence review of the licensing structure. The document submitted to the acquisition team as a completed assignment contains my name typed at the bottom. The electronic signature certificate attached to that document is not mine. The CFO, a careful man named Harold Brent, who I had always respected for his thoroughness, turned to the relevant page in his folder. His reading glasses moved slowly down the document. Ryan's forensic investigator opened the locked evidence case and placed a technical report on the table. The investigator said, the signature certificate was generated from Mr. Marshall's executive laptop at 2:13 in the morning, 3 weeks ago. Metadata from the certificate creation event was preserved and secured last night. A copy has been delivered to federal authorities. The room went very quiet. Board members were looking at each other across the table in the particular way that board members look at each other when they realize they are sitting inside a situation that is about to become significantly more complicated than they were told it would be. This is a misunderstanding about document sequencing. The final version of the assignment was a revision of the draft Claire had already approved in principle, I said. Then why was it generated at 2 in the morning from your personal laptop rather than by the company's legal team? He did not answer. Caroline leaned back in her chair and affected the expression of someone watching a tedious procedural dispute that does not concern her. She said, this sounds like a bitter ex-wife attempting to punish a man for moving on. David built this company. The platform functions because he created the business environment in which it could flourish. I looked at her directly. You downloaded the Meridian source documentation from Ryan's acquisition portal on 4 separate nights over the last 6 weeks. You then forwarded that documentation to a private equity firm based in Denver. The firm is controlled by your brother-in-law. The stillness that fell over Caroline in that moment was the kind of stillness that is not composure. It is the stillness of a person whose next breath requires them to decide very quickly which version of the truth they can still plausibly claim. Ryan folded his hands on the table. Did you imagine that my security team would not trace the transfer? David turned to look at Caroline. He said, you told me you were arranging bridge financing, Caroline said. I was protecting an investment by moving documents you had already agreed did not belong to your wife. Don't perform outrage. You forged her signature. You told me she would never notice because she always trusted you too much to check. The board watched them. I placed one hand on the back of the nearest empty chair and addressed the room. I said the acquisition cannot proceed. Effective at noon today, Meridian Logic LLC is suspending Marshall Hospitality's operational license pending a full forensic audit. I want to be clear about what that means for the people who work in this company. Basic hotel operations will remain fully active. I will not punish employees for decisions they did not make and did not know about. Expansion modules, forecasting tools, and optimization systems will be suspended until the audit is complete. I have also filed for divorce this morning and requested an emergency injunction preventing the transfer of any marital or company assets while proceedings are ongoing. David said, you cannot do this because you are angry. I looked at him. I am not angry enough to hurt people who did nothing wrong. I am, however, finished allowing you to profit from work you spent 12 years describing as insignificant. The board voted to suspend David's executive authority pending investigation. The acquisition was halted. Two board members resigned by the end of the day. Walking out of that building, I felt something I had not expected to feel in the middle of a legal crisis. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter than either of those. The specific sensation of standing in the full space of your own life for the first time in years. Even when that life is currently on fire. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. The forensic audit began the following Monday. I had hired a team recommended by Naomi, led by an examiner named Dr. Sandra Coro, who had spent 15 years with the federal government before going into private practice. Sandra was the kind of person who communicated primarily through documents and whose emotional reactions existed only as footnotes at the bottom of spreadsheets. I found this deeply comforting. The first week of the audit was what I thought of as the unsurprising section. Creative accounting around marketing expenses. Vendor invoices that were slightly inflated in ways that could be explained as negligence or could be explained as fraud, depending on how charitable you felt. Contracts that favored David's personal connections over competitive bidding. The ordinary archaeology of a small company run by a man who believed that the rules were guidelines for people who lacked the confidence to operate above them. I sat with Sandra's team every evening going through the findings. I separated what was sloppy from what was deliberate. I looked for the places where a specific intention was visible in the data. The way a specific intention always leaves a trace if you know how to look for it. And then in the second week, Sandra called me at 7 in the morning. She said, "I need you to come in. There is something here that is different from the rest." I drove to the offices Sandra had set up in a neutral building downtown. She met me at the door. She had the look of a person who has been awake since 3 in the morning and is not entirely certain how to tell you what they have found. There were 5 properties in Marshall Hospitality's portfolio that operated under a specialized management agreement with an organization called the Harlow Children's Foundation. The foundation provided temporary housing for families whose children were receiving long-term medical treatment at hospitals in 3 cities. Families from rural areas, mostly. Families who had driven hours to get their child to a specialist and had nowhere to stay while the treatment lasted. Under the terms of the management agreement, a percentage of profits from each of the 5 Harlow-affiliated properties flowed into a protected renovation account. The account existed specifically to fund accessibility improvements, wider doorways, grab bars, accessible bathrooms, family kitchens on each floor. The kinds of modifications that make a difference to a family arriving with a child in a wheelchair who has already had the worst year of their life. Nearly $2 million was missing from that account. Sandra walked me through the withdrawal records. They were meticulous, methodically documented with invoices from a contractor called Reedway Design. The invoices described completed work, accessible bathrooms finished and certified, safety railings installed and inspected, family kitchens renovated. The invoices had been approved by David. The payment authorizations had his signature on every one. Reedway Design, Sandra explained, tracing her finger along the corporate registration document on her desk, was a shell company. It had no employees, no physical address beyond a registered agent in a commercial mailbox facility in suburban Atlanta. Its ownership traced, through 2 holding layers, to a family name I recognized immediately. It was Caroline Reed's maiden name. I sat across from Sandra's desk, and I looked at the photographs she had printed from site visits the foundation had commissioned 3 months earlier, before any of this had surfaced. The hallways at Harlow House were narrow. The elevator buttons were placed too high for a person in a wheelchair to reach. One bathroom had a doorway that would not accommodate a standard chair width. The walls were peeling in 2 of the family kitchen areas. The safety railings that had been invoiced and paid for and certified as complete did not exist. None of it had ever been built. I have been asked since, by journalists and by people in comment sections, and once by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell this story, what the moment felt like when I understood what I was looking at. People expect me to say I felt rage, and there was rage, eventually. But what I felt first was something much simpler and much worse. I felt sick, because I had been focused for 2 weeks on a legal battle over a company, over intellectual property and forged signatures and a fraudulent acquisition. I had been fighting for my work, and all of that was real and all of that mattered. But what I was looking at now was a photograph of a hallway that a 10-year-old girl could not get through in her wheelchair. I called Beth that night. I had not cried once since David had packed his suitcase. Not when I found the photographs in Ryan's envelope. Not when I walked into the boardroom. Not when the acquisition was halted. I had kept myself in the mode of a person managing a crisis because there were things to be done and people who needed me to be capable of doing them. But I sat on my kitchen floor that night and I called Beth and I told her what Sandra had found. And I cried in a way that I had not cried since my mother died. Not controlled and not quiet. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere below grief. Beth drove over. She sat on the kitchen floor beside me without being asked. She said, "You didn't know." I said, "I should have looked harder. He made sure you wouldn't." She was right. David had made sure of it. The licensing structure, the access controls, the way the company's financial reporting was organized. All of it had been arranged over years in ways that kept me in my lane. My lane was software. My lane was the code. The financial operations were his domain, and I had accepted that division of responsibility because I trusted him, and because I was too busy building the thing he was quietly hollowing out. One of the things I have learned, and I want to say this clearly because it matters, a partner who manages your access to information is not protecting you. They are protecting themselves. There is a difference between a division of labor and a design blind spot. I had spent 12 years in a design blind spot and called it partnership. Sandra's team continued building the file. Ryan's investigators, working in parallel, traced the flow of the money that had gone to Reedway Design. A portion of it had been reinvested into a lakefront vacation property in Maine. The closing documents for that property, obtained through discovery in Ryan's divorce proceedings, had Caroline's name on them. Ryan brought that information to me. He called first. He did not arrive at my door with an agenda and an assumed invitation. He called and asked if he could come over, and he arrived at the time he said he would arrive. And he sat at my kitchen table, and he placed the documents in front of me, and he said, "What do you need to protect this?" I thought about that question for a moment. I said, "An independent, secure backup, not tied to either of our companies. If David finds out what we have found, he will start destroying files. He always moves when he feels cornered," Ryan said. "I know a retired federal examiner who runs a secure documentation service. Naomi can engage her directly. The evidentiary privilege would belong entirely to you." I said, "You're making sure I control the evidence." He said, "It is your case." He said it simply, like it was obvious, like it required no credit. I had spent 12 years next to a man who walked into rooms mid-sentence and called it partnership. The contrast was not subtle. The federal referral was being prepared. Sandra estimated we were 3 to 4 weeks from a resolution. I allowed myself one evening that felt close to peace. I made dinner. I opened a bottle of wine that was not the wedding wine because I had thrown that bottle in the recycling the morning after Ryan had arrived at my door. And then at 9 that evening, my phone showed me a notification from a news aggregator. The headline read, "Devoted husband attempts reconciliation after separation, wife refuses to open door." Beneath it was a photograph. My front porch. David standing on the steps holding flowers. My door closed. The timestamp on the photograph was 45 minutes earlier. I had not opened the door because I had seen the camera lens through the hedgerow before I got to it. But the photograph did not show that part. Let me tell you about how David Marshall attempted to turn a criminal fraud case into a story about a cold wife and a heartbroken husband. Because I want you to understand what this kind of move looks like when you see it. Not so you can feel worse about people who do it, so you can recognize it before it lands. The photograph was published on a lifestyle news site that specialized in the kind of story that frames a woman's refusal as evidence of her emotional failure. The caption described David as a man seeking an amicable resolution who had been met with hostility. There were 14 comments within the first hour that used the word bitter. 2 days later, David appeared on a business podcast. The host was sympathetic in the particular way of someone who has been given a version of events in advance and found it compelling. David described himself as a self-made founder whose former partner had aligned with a billionaire rival to seize control of a company he had built after he sought an amicable separation. He spoke about the strain of high-pressure entrepreneurship on personal relationships. He used the word vindictive twice without ever attaching it to a specific action. Caroline, for her part, posted a photograph of herself and David on a rented boat somewhere with a lot of sunshine. The caption said, "Truth outlasts jealousy. I want to be honest with you about what these things felt like, because the instinct, when someone is publicly misrepresenting your reality, is enormous and immediate and feels almost physical. The need to correct the record, to explain, to pull out the actual documents and the actual timeline and say, here, look, this is what actually happened. This is who actually did what." I talked myself down from that instinct 3 separate times over 4 days. Beth, on the phone, was characteristically clear about it. She said, "Don't. He is trying to pull you onto his stage. He cannot win on evidence. He knows he cannot win on evidence. The only thing he can still control is your reaction. If you respond publicly, the story becomes about the conflict between you. It stops being about what he did." You fight on evidence. Let him have the performance. I listened to Beth. It was one of the harder things I have done. The principle she was describing matters beyond this specific situation, and I want to name it directly. If someone is working to make your story about your reaction instead of their action, they are doing it because your reaction is the only variable they can still influence. Your evidence is fixed. Your timeline is fixed. What they did is fixed. What you do in response to their public performance is the only thing they can still shape. Do not give them that. I said nothing publicly. I referred 3 interview requests to Naomi. I took long walks in the mornings and called Beth in the evenings and kept working. 6 weeks after the boardroom, the arbitration clause surfaced. David's attorney leaked it to a financial publication. The story framed it as a significant legal development that could alter the ownership dispute entirely. The clause was buried in a contract revision I had signed 4 years earlier, during what I can only describe as the worst tax season of my adult life. At a moment when David had placed a folder in front of me and said, "Sign where I've marked." It's a routine renewal with updated indemnification language. I had signed where he marked. The clause, as David's attorney was now arguing, created a mandatory arbitration pathway for any ownership disputes related to the licensing agreement, and the arbitration venue specified in the clause had rules that would have been significantly favorable to Marshall Hospitality as a contracting party rather than to Meridian Logic as the licensor. I sat at my kitchen table at midnight reading that contract, the one I had signed in good faith, the one I had not read closely because David had told me it was routine. Naomi walked me through it the next morning. She said, "The clause is real. His argument about its application is not as strong as his team is suggesting publicly, but it creates a procedural complication that we will need to address before we can move the federal timeline forward." I said, "How long does that take?" She said, "Weeks, possibly months, depending on the arbitration panel." I sat with that. And then the following morning, I arrived at Meridian's new office to find that 3 of my engineers had not come in. I called the first one, a young woman named Priya who had been with me for 6 years and who was, without question, one of the most gifted systems architects I had ever worked with. Her phone went directly to voicemail. I called the second, same. The third answered. He sounded genuinely distressed. He said, "Claire, I'm sorry. They offered us double, all 3 of us, the same night. The same anonymous company. I tried to call you, but it was 2 in the morning, and by the time I could think clearly, I had already signed the offer." I asked him the name of the company. He told me. I gave the name to Sandra, who traced the registered agent in less than 4 hours. The trail ran back to a holding entity with connections to Caroline's brother-in-law, the same man whose private equity firm had received stolen Meridian source documentation. They were trying to hollow out the technical team before the criminal case could land. If Meridian had no engineers, the platform would degrade. Without the platform, the licensing value collapsed. Without the licensing value, the legal dispute became a fight over a diminished asset rather than a fight over something worth protecting. In 12 hours, I had gone from feeling like I had won something real to wondering if I had anything left to protect. I drove to Ryan's building. I had called ahead. He was waiting in his office with Naomi and Sandra already present, which told me he had understood what was happening before I arrived. I said, "They are not trying to win the legal case. They are trying to make the prize not worth winning." Ryan said, "We know," I said. "The arbitration clause slows us down on the criminal timeline. The engineers defecting disrupts the platform. They are running both strategies simultaneously." Naomi said, "We filed to challenge the arbitration clause on the basis that it was included in the contract under fraudulent misrepresentation. That is a defensible argument and it buys us time to stabilize." I said, "What about the engineers?" Ryan looked at me. He said, "What do you need to rebuild the team?" 4 weeks and the right people, he said. "You have both. Whatever you need." I want to tell you something about what it felt like in that room. Not the legal strategy, not the tactics, the actual feeling of sitting across from someone who was not asking what they would get out of solving your problem, who was not calculating what your problem was worth to their agenda, who was simply asking what you needed and meaning the question. I had spent 12 years in a marriage where my needs existed as inconveniences to be routed around. The simplicity of being asked directly and genuinely was almost disorienting. I rebuilt the team in 4 weeks. I hired Priya back at a rate that made the anonymous company's offer look modest. She came back because she said the work was better and because, I think, she had spent 4 weeks feeling guilty and needed to act on it. And then Caroline texted me. The text came on a Thursday afternoon. It said, "We are the only 2 people who truly understand what these men are capable of. I think we should handle this like adults. Lunch." I read it twice. Then I called Naomi. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to meet her." Naomi said. We can make that legally useful if you want to. Under state law, a one-party recording is admissible. I wore a device that Naomi's security contact fitted in under 3 minutes. I chose the restaurant myself, a lunch place with large windows and visible security cameras, and a table near the front where the light was good and the ambient noise was low enough that a recording would be clean. Ryan would wait in a private dining room in the back, not to protect me from the conversation, because Caroline had specified, in a follow-up message, that she wanted Ryan to bring a financial release document that she wished to review before anything else was discussed. Caroline arrived 9 minutes late, which I noted was a choice rather than an accident. She was wearing a cream blazer that felt like a deliberate echo of mine in the boardroom. No jewelry. The confidence I had seen at the charity gala was still present, but worn thinner at the edges. The way expensive fabric starts to show stress at the seams before it actually tears. She said, "You look well. Divorce suits you. You asked to settle something." She took her time with the menu, ordered sparkling water and a salad she would not eat. Then she set the menu aside and looked at me with the expression of a woman who has calculated that directness is her best remaining option. She said, "I want to propose something practical. I will pay you a settlement figure that accounts for a fair valuation of Meridian's contribution to Marshall Hospitality's growth over the last 6 years. In exchange, you release the fraud claim related to the renovation funds, and you release the Meridian license to a third-party investor who can manage the platform independently." I said. "Which investor?" She said. "An established fund with experience in hospitality technology. The investor who received stolen Meridian source documentation from your email account. The one whose fund wired Readway Design $600,000 over the last 14 months. Her fingers stopped moving. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. I said, "You just confirmed that you know which connection needed proving." Ryan and Naomi walked in from the back corridor. Sandra's investigator followed with a tablet, displaying the wire transfer records and the security footage from Ryan's acquisition portal. Caroline looked at Ryan. She said, "Tell them this is enough. I will sign the divorce papers. I will return the main property. You can keep the apartment," Ryan said. "The apartment was never what this was about. Caroline, the children's money was." She turned to me, and the expression she wore then was one I have thought about many times since. Not guilt. Exactly, not remorse. Something more complicated. The expression of a person who knows they did a terrible thing and is hoping the specificity of your feelings about it might be a lever they can use. She said, "You think he is kind. Watch how easily he walks away from someone he once said he loved." I looked at her. I said, "Protecting someone from consequences is not love. It never was." The recording was later described by the federal prosecutor as one of the cleaner pieces of direct admission evidence her office had received in a case of this complexity. After Caroline and her attorney had been escorted out by building security, Ryan and I sat for a few minutes in the now empty dining room. Naomi was on her phone. Sandra was managing documents at the next table. Ryan said, "How are you?" It was such a simple question. He asked it the way someone asks who genuinely wants to know the answer and is prepared to sit with it. I said, "I think I am mostly all right." He said, "That is a reasonable place to be." I said, "You didn't have to do any of this. The acquisition was already stopped. You could have taken the evidence you had and walked away." He said, "I know." I said, "Why didn't you?" Quiet for a moment. He said, "Because the right thing to do and the convenient thing to do are the same thing so rarely that when they coincide, I try to pay attention." I thought about that for a while. Then I said, "The hard part is behind us now." Ryan looked at me with something cautious in his expression. He said, almost, what I did not anticipate. In the week after the lunch, was that two desperate people who realize they are trapped will stop trying to escape separately and begin trying to burn everything down together. David and Caroline had been operating on the assumption that their strategies were competing. His lawyers against her lawyers. His leverage against her leverage. The transaction he needed against the asset she wanted. When it became clear that both strategies had failed and that the federal timeline was accelerating, they did the one thing I had not modeled for. They coordinated. Not in any formal or explicit way. I do not think they sat in a room and agreed on a plan. I think it was more organic than that. Two people who had each contributed to a shared crime, each realizing that the other person's cooperation or defection would determine the outcome of the case, each choosing in the same 48-hour window to escalate rather than retreat. The arbitration clause challenge was moving forward. The engineering team was stabilized. The federal referral was with prosecutors, and then David's legal team released, to every major financial publication that would run it, a detailed analysis arguing that the arbitration clause rendered Meridian Logic's ownership claim fundamentally uncertain, not definitively void. They were careful about that because a definitive claim they could not support would have constituted misrepresentation. Just uncertain enough that the acquisition deal, which had been publicly reported as halted, could theoretically be revived under a restructured framework. Three of Marshall Hospitality's board members, under pressure from shareholders who had been watching the company's valuation drop for 2 months, issued a statement saying they believed a negotiated resolution would be in the best interests of all parties. That statement was carefully worded to sound like a call for calm and reason, what it actually was. And Naomi explained this to me with the controlled anger of a person who has seen this exact move before, was a signal to the acquisition market that the board was not fully aligned behind my position. It was an invitation for David's remaining legal team to find a procedural foothold, the same night that statement was released. Caroline's brother-in-law's firm contacted 2 additional Meridian engineers, both of whom had joined in the 4 weeks since I had rebuilt the team. They had not been with me long enough to have the kind of loyalty that holds under a generous offer delivered at midnight with a 48-hour expiration. One of them left. The other called me immediately, which I was grateful for. But the fact that I was being grateful that only 1 out of 2 left told me something about the stability of the situation I had not fully acknowledged. I sat in my home office at 1 in the morning looking at the arbitration challenge timeline, the board member's statement, the engineering departure, and the federal case status simultaneously. And I did the thing I had trained myself not to do in moments of crisis, which is engage in an honest accounting of what you have and what you are missing. What I had, the original license documents, the forensic evidence, the recorded lunch with Caroline, the forged signature metadata, the Readway design trail, Sandra's complete audit, and a federal referral that prosecutors had described as strong. What I was missing, a clean procedural path that wasn't slowed by the arbitration challenge, a fully stable technical team, and the kind of public record that would allow Harlow's donors and the general public to understand what had happened before David's legal team could further muddy the timeline. I called Naomi at 1:30 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had not been sleeping either. I said, "The Harlow Foundation Gala is in 3 weeks." She said, "I know." I said, "David is scheduled to receive the Leadership Award." She said, "I know that too." The foundation's board chair is Dr. Patricia Hayes. She was a federal appeals court judge for 14 years before she took the foundation role. She is not a person who makes decisions without a complete picture. Naomi was quiet. Then she said, "What are you proposing?" I said, "I am proposing that we give Dr. Hayes the complete picture." Naomi said, "If we brief the foundation board before the gala, David's team will find out. They may attempt to preempt." I said, "If we don't brief them and the gala happens as planned, David receives a public endorsement that he will use for the next 12 months to argue that independent institutions have reviewed his record and found him credible." Another silence. Naomi said, "I need 24 hours to prepare the briefing materials." I said, "You have them." I also did something else that night. I wrote out, by hand in the worn leather notebook, where I had first sketched the Meridian algorithms at my mother's kitchen table, every version of the story I was afraid of. The version where the arbitration clause won. The version where the board member statement gave David the procedural opening he needed. The version where the federal case took 18 months and in the meantime he had rebuilt enough of a public narrative that the outcome felt ambiguous even when it wasn't. I wrote them all out. And then I wrote, underneath all of them, "The evidence is real regardless of what the procedure does with it. The evidence does not change. The work does not unexist. The money that is missing from Harlow House is missing whether or not anyone ever corrects the public record." I closed the notebook. I got 3 hours of sleep. And in the morning I got dressed and I drove to meet with Dr. Patricia Hayes. Dr. Patricia Hayes was 71 years old and approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall. And she had the particular quality of presence that belongs to people who spent decades in rooms where they were the final authority. She did not take up a lot of physical space, but she occupied all of the air. We met in her office at the foundation's administrative building, which was quiet in the way that spaces dedicated to serious work tend to be quiet. No decorative noise, no ambient music, just the sound of a working institution going about its business. She shook my hand and she looked at me for a moment before she said anything. The way a person looks who is taking an accurate measure rather than a social one. She said, "I know who you are, Mrs. Marshall. I looked at the Meridian platform 2 years ago when we were evaluating management systems for Harlow House. I asked David Marshall who had built it. He said it was a company product developed by his technical team." I said, "I know." She said, "Sit down. I want to hear everything." We sat in her office for 3 hours. Ryan was there. Naomi was there. Sandra presented the audit findings. Ryan's forensic investigator walked through the Reedway design trail and the falsified site documentation. Naomi laid out the forged signature evidence and the federal referral timeline. Dr. Hayes asked questions that told me she had read every document in the briefing package before we arrived. She did not ask for context on things she understood. She went directly to the places where the evidence was most contested, the places where David's legal team had the strongest counterarguments, and she made us defend our positions in those specific spots. At the end, she looked at the photographs from the Harlow site visit, the narrow doorways, the missing railings, the deteriorating family kitchens. She said, "Could any of this be attributed to accounting error or administrative negligence rather than deliberate fraud?" Sandra said, "No. The falsified photographs were edited. Images from unrelated properties were relabeled as Harlow rooms and submitted as documentation of completed renovations. The editing originated from Miss Reed's personal computer. Mr. Marshall emailed her the required room numbers and specifications to make the substitution convincing." Dr. Hayes sat with that for a long moment. She said, "We could cancel the award quietly. Withdraw it without public explanation." I looked at the photographs again. The family waiting in a hallway too narrow for a wheelchair. Staying in a building that was supposed to have been renovated with money they had helped raise. I said, "The families who stayed in those properties deserve to know why the renovations never happened. The donors who gave money for those bathrooms deserve to know why the bathrooms don't exist. I am not asking you to harm the federal investigation. I am asking you to correct your own institution's record, Doctor." Hayes looked at me. She said, "Then we will correct it." She asked us to stay available by phone the evening of the gala. She would handle everything from the stage herself. On the afternoon of the gala, Ryan called me. He said, "David's team has somehow heard that the foundation is making a change to the program. His attorney filed an emergency motion this afternoon to delay the federal referral on the basis that the foundation's action would constitute prejudicial publicity." I said, "Can they succeed?" Naomi, who was on the call, said, "The motion is thin. The judge assigned to the referral matter is not someone who responds well to delay tactics, but it adds noise." Ryan said, "Do you still want to go tonight?" I said, "Yes." He said, "All right, I'll pick you up at 7. I wore my mother's pearl earrings again, the same ones I had worn to the boardroom. Not as a deliberate symbol, just because they were hers and because on the nights when I needed to remember that I was still myself, the small material continuities mattered." Ryan picked me up at 7, as he said he would. We drove to the Ashford Hotel mostly in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence between two people who have been through enough together that they do not need to fill every space with words. At a red light, he said, "However tonight goes, you did the right thing." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." The hotel was lit up. Photographers at the entrance. Donors in evening wear. The particular atmosphere of a charitable event where the celebration is genuine but sits slightly awkwardly alongside the awareness that the need being celebrated should not have to exist. David arrived 20 minutes after we did, with Caroline on his arm. He was wearing the tuxedo I had helped him choose in London. She was wearing white, which struck me as a choice so bold it circled back around to something that was almost fascinating to observe. He saw me near the foundation's family tables, speaking with a young girl in a wheelchair and her mother. I had met them in the lobby, and they had asked me to sit with them for a few minutes, and I had, because the girl wanted to tell me about the scheduling app her hospital used and whether I had built anything like it. I heard her out. I answered her questions. She was 12, and she had opinions about user interface design that were better developed than those of several professional product managers I had worked with. Ryan stood beside me during this conversation. He did not interject. He listened. When the girl said something that made me laugh, a real laugh, the kind that surprised me, I saw him watch it with an expression he did not compose back into neutrality. David, across the room, gripped Caroline's arm more tightly, and then Dr. Patricia Hayes walked to the microphone. Dr. Hayes did not use notes. She stood at the microphone with the stillness of a person who has addressed difficult rooms many times and has learned that stillness is its own kind of authority. The ballroom was full, several hundred people, a dozen journalists. "Cameras at the back," she said. "Good evening. Tonight, the Harlow Children's Foundation intended to honor a business leader whose company managed our residential properties. Instead, I owe you an apology. And more importantly, I owe our families an apology." The room's ambient noise dropped to almost nothing. The screen behind her lit up with two photographs side by side. On the left, the renovation documentation David's team had submitted. A renovated accessible bathroom. Clean tile, proper fixture placement, a doorway width that met accessibility standards. On the right, a photograph taken at the actual Harlow property, a bathroom with a doorway too narrow for a standard wheelchair, paint peeling from the wall above the sink, no grab bars, Dr. Hayes said. An independent audit has confirmed that approximately $2 million in restricted renovation funds designated for Harlow House were not used for renovations. The documentation submitted to our board over the past 4 years was falsified. We have referred the matter to federal authorities. We have terminated Marshall Hospitality's management contract with the foundation, effective tonight, and there will be no leadership award. The room erupted, not in a single direction. A wave of sound that was part shock and part murmured confirmation and part the specific noise journalists make when a story they had half suspected becomes documentable. David stood so quickly his chair hit the floor behind him, he said, loudly enough that the people near him could hear. This is fabricated. Records were manipulated by a vindictive former employee with a financial interest in destroying this company. Dr. Hayes did not look at him, she said, into the microphone, with complete steadiness. Claire Marshall was never employed by Harlow or by Marshall Hospitality. She identified the discrepancy and funded the forensic investigation that confirmed it. Meridian Logic LLC and Reed Enterprises have jointly guaranteed the missing renovation budget. Construction at all 5 Harlow properties begins Monday morning. Applause started at the family tables. The 12-year-old I had spoken with in the lobby was clapping with her whole body. Her mother had her hand pressed over her mouth. The applause spread across the room in the particular way that applause spreads when the people in a room are genuinely moved rather than performatively enthusiastic. David pushed toward me through the crowd. Ryan moved one step to his left, placing himself at an angle that was not threatening but was also not ambiguous. I put my hand on Ryan's sleeve. He stopped. I stepped forward to meet David. His face was doing several things at once. Fury and desperation, and something that might once have been shame but had been living under too many layers of rationalization for too long to surface cleanly, quietly enough that only I could hear. This is not what you think it is. Caroline handled the invoices. I approved documents she told me were legitimate. She ran the shell company. I didn't know what Reedway was, I said. You emailed her the room numbers, David. You told her which rooms to photograph at which hotels to make the substitution convincing. He said those emails were taken out of context. I said, you approved every invoice. Your name is on every authorization. He said, Claire, we were married for 12 years. I said, I know. He said, you know me. You know I would not deliberately steal from sick children. I looked at him, and I thought about the second cup of coffee I had kept warm for myself for 12 years that always went cold. The conferences where he had introduced me as the woman who preferred to stay behind the scenes. The contract revision he had placed in front of me during tax season and called routine. The 2 a.m. timestamp on a signature certificate generated from his laptop. I said, I know you approved invoices for renovation work you never confirmed had been completed, for a foundation that housed families whose children were in chemotherapy. I know you signed documents that represented the work as done. I know what the photographs show, whether you knew exactly what Caroline was doing or whether you chose not to look closely enough to know. The outcome is the same for those families. He had nothing to say to that. Caroline appeared at his shoulder. Her white dress had lost the statement it was meant to make. She looked, for the first time, like a person experiencing the actual consequences of something she had done. She said to David, with the cold specificity of someone who has nothing left to protect and knows it, you told me charities never audit contractor work properly. You said it would be fine. You said she never read legal documents closely enough to notice. The phones around us turned toward her voice. David said, lower your voice, she said. You promised the acquisition would close before anyone looked. You said we would be gone before the renovation timeline was even questioned. Ryan, from somewhere behind me, spoke in a voice that was very even and very final. He said, security. 2 staff members appeared immediately. They did not touch David. They positioned themselves in a way that made the direction of travel clear. As David was being guided toward the exit, he passed close enough to me to speak. He said, quietly and bitterly, Reed only helped you because he wanted leverage over Caroline. When he has what he needs, he will walk away and you will be a footnote to his divorce settlement. That is who he is. I looked across the room at Ryan. He was standing at Dr. Hayes' side, handing her a document that I recognized as the deed transferring the renovation guarantee funds directly to the foundation. No press announcement, no cameras pointed at him. Just a quiet handoff and a brief exchange, and then he was looking for me across the crowd. I turned back to David. He matched my commitment to those renovations, dollar for dollar, quietly. That is something you never once learned to do. David said nothing. He left. I walked back to where the families were sitting. The 12-year-old asked me if I thought the new bathrooms would have a certain kind of faucet that was easier for her to operate. I said I would make sure of it. She said she was going to look up Meridian because she wanted to understand how it worked. I said she should. The federal case moved quickly once Caroline made the decision to cooperate. She contacted prosecutors 7 weeks after the gala. She exchanged access to her cloud accounts for a negotiated consideration. And those cloud accounts contained things that transformed an already strong case into an overwhelming one. Voice recordings from their time at the main property, copies of internal communications about the shell company, messages in which David explicitly discussed the renovation invoice scheme, an email thread about the forged signature in which David described my trust in him as something he relied on, and therefore something he had earned the right to use. David retaliated immediately. He produced his own set of documentation showing that Caroline had established the shell company, altered the photographs, and controlled the contractor relationship. He argued that he had signed off on documents he believed were legitimate based on her representations. He was not entirely wrong about what she had done, but he had been a willing participant who had understood enough of the scheme to benefit from it and to make choices that protected its operation. The evidence made that clear. Together, in the process of trying to minimize their individual exposure at each other's expense, David and Caroline dismantled each other's defenses faster and more thoroughly than any investigator could have managed alone. At a pre-trial hearing, federal prosecutors introduced an audio recording Caroline had made at the main property. The recording had been made on her phone during an argument 18 months earlier, apparently as insurance that she had since decided to redeem. On the recording, David's voice was relaxed, confident. He was explaining something to Caroline about the acquisition timeline and why the schedule had been arranged the way it had been arranged. He said, in a tone that was casual in the way that makes the content of the statement land harder. Claire signs where I put the marker. She wants to believe that marriage means I would never use her name against her. She has been carrying this company for 10 years, and she still thinks being gracious is the same as being protected. By the morning after that clip became part of the public record, every professional contact David had maintained through the previous 18 months of the dispute had gone silent. The sentencing took place on a Thursday morning in federal court. Caroline Reed received 14 months federal imprisonment, 3 years of supervised release, and a full restitution order. David Marshall received 42 months federal imprisonment on charges of aggravated identity theft, conspiracy, wire fraud, and theft from a federally supported charitable organization. I was present for the sentencing. I had submitted a victim impact statement that the judge read in full before issuing the sentence. She quoted from the final paragraph in her remarks. My statement said, David Marshall did not steal only money. He stole time. Years in which I reduced myself to preserve a peace that was never real. A sentence cannot return those years. It can establish that silence is not consent, that trust is not a blank check, and that the person who does the work owns the work. The judge said those words from the bench, and then she sentenced David to 3.5 years in federal prison. I drove myself home from the courthouse. I had been doing a lot of things alone that year that I had previously done in the context of a marriage, and I had discovered something I did not expect about that solitude. It was not lonely in the way I had feared it would be. It had a quality I can only describe as spacious, like rooms that had been crowded with furniture suddenly cleared, and what was left was just the actual shape of the space. Beth met me at my house with takeout containers and the specific expression she wears when she is prepared to sit with you through something without asking you to feel any particular way about it. We ate on the kitchen floor, not because there was any reason to be on the floor rather than at the table, but because it was where we had ended up the night I had called her crying. And we had not consciously decided to go back to that spot, but we did. She said, how do you feel? I thought about it, I said, strangely quiet. Not the waiting kind of quiet, a different kind, she said. The finished kind, I said. Maybe. My divorce was finalized 2 weeks later. On a Tuesday, I drove to the courthouse alone because I had decided that some things you should do in your own company. Beth met me outside afterward. We went to lunch. I ate an entire meal without looking at my phone once, which had not happened in approximately 2 years. That evening, Ryan called. He said, how was it? I said, anticlimactic, in the best possible way. Just paperwork and a judge and then it was done, he said. Are you all right? I said, I think I genuinely am. I'd like to take you to dinner, not to celebrate anything specific. Just dinner, I said. I would like that. We ate at a harbor diner that had been in the same building for 40 years and had checkered tablecloths and a pie display case, and absolutely no ambience of the kind that establishments cultivate deliberately. It was the best meal I had eaten in a long time. Halfway through, He ordered a slice of blueberry pie and called it a legitimate occasion for dessert, which it was not in any conventional sense, but which I decided to agree with. I reached across the table and took his hand. He looked at our hands and then at me. I said, "Thank you for not making any of this about rescuing me," he said. "You were never the one who needed rescuing." I said, "Caroline told me you collect undervalued things." He said, "You are not undervalued anymore. Your licensing fees have become genuinely alarming." I laughed. The kind of laugh that surprises you by arriving before you could decide to let it. The kind that sounds like yourself. He held my hand a little more firmly. He said, "I want to tell you something. I loved you before the gala. Before the recording and the sentencing and all of it. I loved you when you were sitting on the other side of a table in a boardroom and laying out exactly what you had and exactly what you intended to do with it. I waited to say it because I did not want love to feel like another deadline." He said it the way someone says something they have been carrying for a while and have finally found the right moment to set down. Not a performance. Not a declaration designed to produce a specific response. Just information. Something I was free to do whatever I wanted with. I said, "I love you too, and I am keeping the licensing fees." He said, "I expected nothing less." 6 months after the sentencing, construction was completed at all 5 Harlow House properties. New accessible bathrooms, widened doorways with soft close mechanisms, a rooftop garden at the Chicago location that had been requested by the families who stayed there longest, family kitchens on every residential floor with appliances at accessible heights. I also gave the foundation a scheduling system I built in my own time and donated permanently. It connected the hospital appointment management systems at all 3 partner hospitals with the Harlow House room availability system, so that families didn't have to make 2 separate calls to coordinate their housing with their treatment calendar. It was not technically complicated. It was just the kind of thing that, once you understood the problem from the inside, was obvious to build. At the ribbon cutting at the first completed property, the Harlow location in Boston, Dr. Hayes asked me to cut the ribbon. I asked the 12-year-old girl I had spoken with at the gala to hold the scissors with me. She was there with her mother. She was mid-treatment, doing better than the previous fall. Her mother told me quietly. She was still interested in how Meridian worked. I had sent her some introductory reading a few months earlier, and she had sent back a list of questions that I had answered in detail. She held the scissors. We cut the ribbon together. The crowd around us was small and unglamorous and entirely composed of people who had genuine reasons to be there. I thought about the night I had stood in a doorway holding 2 glasses of wine that I had set out from habit, watching a man pack a suitcase with more care than he had ever spent on the marriage we were supposed to share. I had thought endurance was love. I had measured my worth by how little space I needed, how much friction I could absorb, how quietly I could make myself move through a life I had quietly built for someone else's benefit. David did not create that belief. He built a career on top of it, which is a different thing. The belief had roots in me. In the particular way I had learned to be small as a form of safety. In the equation I had accepted without examining it that said, if you need very little, you cannot be disappointed. And if you cannot be disappointed, you are protected from grief. What I know now is that equation is wrong. Not because need makes you vulnerable, though it does, but because the protection it offers is the protection of a locked room. You are kept safe from the thing you are afraid of. You are also kept away from everything else. Leaving David did not fix me overnight. Ryan's love did not repair me. What changed was smaller than either of those things and bigger. It was the moment I stopped protecting people from the consequences of how they had treated me. That is the part that nobody tells you about. You do not have to get loud. You do not have to perform your pain, or stage your vindication, or build a narrative that forces everyone to understand what was done to you. You just have to stop absorbing it. You just have to let the consequences land where they belong, instead of catching them in your own body and calling that grace. I spent 12 years catching things that were not mine to carry. The work was always mine. I know that now. If this story found you today, I do not think that is an accident. Maybe you are somewhere inside a version of what I just described. Maybe you are the person who does the work and accepts the title of someone who prefers to stay behind the scenes. Maybe someone in your life has spent a long time making you feel like the quiet engine of someone else's story. Maybe you have been practicing the particular silence that you have told yourself is maturity, and what it actually is fear. I cannot tell you the moment to stop. I do not think anyone can tell you that from the outside. But I can tell you what it felt like when I did. It felt like a lock turning. And on the other side of it was not safety. Exactly. Not peace. Exactly. Not even happiness. Not right away. It was just me, in the full space of my own life. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.